The photograph was found in a metal box buried beneath the floorboards of a collapsed farmhouse in McDowell County, West Virginia, in the autumn of 1998. The house had stood empty for 63 years. When the demolition crew pried open the box, they expected deeds or currency. What they found was a single wedding portrait, perfectly preserved, and a handwritten name on the back that would unravel a silence older than anyone still living. The photograph showed a young couple standing before a wooden chapel. The bride wore a high-collared dress with lace sleeves. The groom's face was calm, his hand resting on her shoulder. Behind them, the mountains rose in soft focus, blurred by the primitive lens of the 1890s. But it was the inscription on the reverse side that stopped the foreman cold. Eliza and Thomas Harlan, married June 14th, 1891. God forgive us both. The crew supervisor, a man named Dale Hutchins, held the photograph under the pale October light. He had lived in McDowell County his entire life. He knew every family name, every graveyard, every story whispered in diners and general stores. But he had never heard of Thomas Harlan. And that was impossible. In a place where genealogy was currency and memory stretched back generations, a name like that, attached to a wedding, to a chapel, to a prayer for forgiveness, should have echoed. Hutchins brought the photograph to the McDowell County Historical Society. Within hours, archivists began searching marriage records, census logs, and church registries. The chapel in the background was identified as the Pine Hollow Baptist Church, which had burned to the ground in 1902. The date matched, the location matched, but there was no record of any marriage between Eliza and Thomas Harlan, no birth certificates, no property deeds, no gravestones. It was as if they had been erased. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because once you hear what was hidden in that farmhouse, you'll understand why some stories were meant to stay buried and why we refused to let them. McDowell County, West Virginia, in the late 19th century was not a place of comfort or excess. It was a land of coal seams and timber, of families who worked until their hands bled and prayed until their voices gave out. The mountains were beautiful and merciless. The winters came early and stayed long. The communities were small, isolated, bound together by blood and necessity. In 1891, the county was in the midst of transformation. The railroads were pushing deeper into the mountains, and with them came coal companies, speculators, and laborers from distant states. The old farming families, those who had lived in the hollows since before the Civil War, watched as their world changed. Some sold their land and left. Others stayed, clinging to what little they had, suspicious of strangers and fiercely protective of their own. The Baptist churches were the backbone of social order. They were places of worship, yes, but also courtrooms, meeting halls, and confessionals. A marriage performed in a church was not just a sacrament. It was a public declaration, a legal contract, and a communal endorsement. To be married was to be recognized. To be recognized was to exist. And yet, Eliza and Thomas Harlan did not exist. The first real clue came from an elderly woman named Ruth Calloway, a retired schoolteacher who had spent 40 years cataloging family histories in the region. When she saw the photograph, her expression changed. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I know that dress." Ruth explained that the lace pattern on Eliza's sleeves was distinctive, a style called Appalachian briar lace, handmade by women in the northern hollows. It was labor-intensive, expensive, and rare. Only wealthy families could afford it. But more importantly, Ruth recognized the dress itself. She had seen it in another photograph taken years earlier of a woman named Eliza Drummond. Eliza Drummond was the daughter of a coal baron named Samuel Drummond, one of the richest men in McDowell County. In the 1880s, the Drummond family controlled thousands of acres of mineral rights and employed over 200 men. They lived in a mansion on the ridge above the town of Bramwell, a house with gas lamps, imported furniture, and servants brought in from Charleston. Eliza was their only child. According to Ruth, Eliza Drummond had vanished in the spring of 1891. There had been no funeral, no obituary, no explanation. The Drummond family simply stopped speaking her name. When neighbors asked, they were told she had gone to live with relatives in Virginia, but no one ever saw her again. The historians cross-reference the dates. Eliza Drummond disappeared in April 1891. The wedding photograph was dated June 14, 1891. 2 months. If the woman in the photograph was Eliza Drummond, then the question became, who was Thomas Harlan? And why had her family erased her from history? The answer began to surface in a place no one had thought to look. The employment records of the Drummond Coal Company, stored in a dusty archive in the county clerk's office. Among the hundreds of names listed in the ledgers for the year 1890, there was one entry that stood out. Thomas Harlan, hired as a surveyor in September 1890, dismissed in March 1891. No reason given. A surveyor was a position of relative status, educated, trusted, often white. But Harlan's entry had a notation in the margin, written in faded ink, mulatto, Tennessee origin. In 1890s West Virginia, that single word carried the weight of an entire social order. A mulatto, a person of mixed black and white ancestry, occupied a liminal, precarious space in Appalachian society. They were neither fully accepted nor entirely cast out, existing in the margins of both communities. In some counties, they could own property and vote. In others, they were subject to the same legal restrictions as black Americans, and in all cases, they were watched. For a wealthy white woman like Eliza Drummond to marry a man of mixed race was not merely scandalous. It was social annihilation. It was the unforgivable sin. The photograph, hidden beneath the floorboards of a farmhouse that no one had entered in 60 years, was not just a wedding portrait. It was evidence of a love that could not be permitted to exist. And the words on the back, "God forgive us both," were not a plea for blessing. They were a confession of defiance. But what had happened to them after the photograph was taken? And why had someone gone to such lengths to bury it? The farmhouse where the photograph was found had belonged to a family named Parrish. The Parrishes were tenant farmers, people of little means who worked land they did not own and lived season to season. According to property records, the house had been abandoned in 1935 during the height of the Great Depression when the family moved north in search of work. They never returned. But in 1891, the Parrish family had still been there. And according to Ruth Calloway, they had been known for one thing: harboring runaways. The term runaways in Appalachia did not only refer to enslaved people fleeing bondage before the Civil War. In the decades after emancipation, it also meant people fleeing debt, violence, or social persecution, those who had broken the unwritten laws of their communities and needed to disappear. The Parrish family, poor and isolated, had a reputation for offering shelter to such people. They asked no questions. They kept no records, and they never spoke of who passed through their doors. Historians began to theorize that Eliza Drummond and Thomas Harlan had fled to the Parrish farmhouse after their wedding. It would have been one of the few places where they could hide, at least temporarily, from the reach of the Drummond family. But hiding was not surviving. In 1891, West Virginia had no formal anti-miscegenation laws on the books. Those would come later, but social enforcement was absolute. A white woman married to a black or mulatto man could be ostracized, disinherited, even endangered, and a man like Thomas Harlan, regardless of his education or character, would be seen as a criminal simply for existing in that union. The Historical Society reached out to descendants of the Parrish family, now scattered across Ohio and Pennsylvania. Most had no knowledge of the photograph or the story. But one woman, a great-granddaughter named Angela Parrish, remembered something her grandmother had told her as a child. She said her grandmother had spoken of a couple who stayed in the house for a short time in the summer of 1891. The woman was sick. The man was kind. Her grandmother had been only 7 years old, but she remembered the woman's dress, white lace, she said, like a bride's. And she remembered the way her parents whispered when they thought the children were asleep. One night, Angela's great-grandmother had heard her father arguing with someone outside. She could not see who it was, but she heard the words clearly. "They're not here. You've got the wrong house." The next morning, the couple was gone. Angela did not know what had happened to them. Her grandmother had never spoken of it again, but she did remember one other detail, a name her grandmother had repeated, as if it had stayed with her all her life. Eliza. The discovery of Angela's testimony gave the investigation new urgency. If Eliza and Thomas had fled the parish house, where had they gone, and had they been pursued? The answer came from an unlikely source, a handwritten letter found in the private collection of a retired minister in Charleston. The letter was dated July 1891 and addressed to a pastor in McDowell County. It read, "Reverend, I write to inform you that a matter of grave concern has been resolved. The woman who brought shame upon her family has been recovered and will be cared for according to the will of her father. The man who led her astray has departed these hills and will not return. I trust this matter will remain sealed in the eyes of God and the community." Signed, Samuel Drummond. The letter was chilling in its brevity. It confirmed that Eliza had been found. It confirmed that Thomas had been departed. And it confirmed that Samuel Drummond, her father, had been involved. But what did recovered mean? And what did departed mean? Historians searched death records, court filings, and newspaper archives from the summer of 1891. There were no reports of a trial, no arrests, no public scandal. But there was one brief notice in the Bramwell Gazette, dated August 3, 1891. Miss Eliza Drummond, daughter of Mr. Samuel Drummond, is convalescing at the family estate following a prolonged illness. The family requests privacy during this difficult time. The word convalescing was a euphemism. In the Victorian era, it was often used to describe women who had been institutionalized, confined, or otherwise removed from public life due to behavior deemed inappropriate or insane. It was a polite way of saying, "She has been locked away." The Drummond estate still stood on the ridge above Bramwell, though it had changed hands several times and was now a bed and breakfast. The current owners granted researchers access to the attic, where old furniture and personal effects from the Drummond family had been stored and forgotten. Among the items, researchers found a leather-bound journal. The handwriting inside was elegant, controlled, and belonged to Eliza Drummond. The journal entries began in January 1890 and continued sporadically through the spring of 1891. In the early pages, Eliza wrote about her daily life, piano lessons, church socials, visits to Charleston. Her tone was dutiful, restrained, the voice of a young woman performing the role expected of her. But in September 1890, the tone changed. She wrote, "Today I met a man who spoke to me as if I had a mind. His name is Thomas. He is a surveyor for Father's company. He is not like the others. He listens." Over the following months, the entries grew more frequent, more intimate. She wrote about long conversations, stolen moments, the thrill of being seen as something more than an ornament. And then, in March 1891, she wrote, "Father has dismissed Thomas. He did not say why, but I know. Someone told him. Someone saw us. I do not care. I will not pretend anymore." The final entry was dated June 13, 1891, one day before the wedding photograph. "Tomorrow we will be married. I know what I am giving up. I know what it will cost. But I would rather live one true day than a lifetime of falsehood. If they find us, so be it. I will not apologize for loving him." There were no more entries. The journal ended, but the search for Thomas Harlan continued. If he had been departed, as Samuel Drummond's letter claimed, then there should have been some record, a departure by train, a crossing into another state, a name on a boarding house register. But there was nothing. Until a researcher named David Klein, a graduate student specializing in Appalachian migration patterns, found a death certificate filed in Mercer County, West Virginia, dated July 22, 1891. The name on the certificate was Thomas Harlan. Cause of death: accidental drowning. Location: Bluestone River, near the town of Princeton. No witnesses. No investigation. David brought the certificate to the Historical Society. The room went silent. Drowning in the Bluestone River was not uncommon. The current was strong, the water cold, and the terrain unforgiving. But the timing was impossible to ignore. Thomas Harlan had departed in July, according to Samuel Drummond's letter, and in July, his body had been found in a river 30 miles from McDowell County. There was no autopsy report, no inquest, no mention of the drowning in any local newspaper. The certificate had been signed by a doctor named Amos Petty, who was known to have treated workers for the Drummond Coal Company. Ruth Calloway, who had been following the investigation from the beginning, made a quiet observation. Accidental drownings were how people disappeared back then. If you wanted someone gone, you called it an accident. And if you had enough money, no one asked questions. The implication was unmistakable. Thomas Harlan had not drowned by accident. He had been killed. And the man who had the most to gain from his death was Samuel Drummond. But proving it, more than a century later, was impossible. The witnesses were dead. The records were incomplete. And the only person who could have testified to the truth, Eliza Drummond, had been silenced. Or had she? Researchers returned to the Drummond estate and searched the attic more thoroughly. This time they found something they had missed before. A small wooden box, hidden beneath a pile of linens containing a stack of letters tied with string. The letters were addressed to Eliza, but they had never been opened. Each one bore the same return address: Weston State Hospital, Weston, West Virginia. Weston State Hospital was an asylum. It had been built in 1864 and was one of the largest psychiatric institutions in the country. In the late 19th century, it was a place where inconvenient people were sent. Women who defied their families, men who challenged authority, anyone whose existence posed a problem. The letters had been sent between August 1891 and November 1893. None of them had been delivered. The Historical Society contacted the West Virginia State Archives, which held patient records for Weston State Hospital. After weeks of legal negotiation, the records were released. Eliza Drummond had been admitted to Weston on August 10, 1891, at the request of her father, Samuel Drummond. The admission form listed her condition as acute melancholia and moral insanity. The attending physician noted that she was uncooperative, delusional, and prone to violent outbursts when questioned about her recent actions. She had been 22 years old. The records showed that Eliza remained at Weston for 2 years. During that time, she was subjected to treatments common in that era: prolonged isolation, cold baths, enforced silence. Her behavior was described as increasingly withdrawn. By 1893, she had stopped speaking altogether. In November 1893, she was released into the custody of her father. There was no follow-up, no record of what happened to her after she left the asylum. But there was one final document in the file, a letter written by Eliza herself, dated September 1891, just 1 month after her admission. The letter had never been sent. It read, "To whoever finds this, I am not insane. I was married to a man I loved, and they killed him for it. My father told me Thomas drowned, but I do not believe him. I will never believe him. They brought me here to make me forget, to make me silent, but I will not forget. I will carry his name until I die. And if there is a God, he will remember what they did. Eliza Harlan." She had signed her married name. Do you think love can survive when the world decides it's a crime? Leave a comment with your answer. I want to know if you believe some bonds are stronger than hate. The letter from Eliza, written in the solitude of an asylum cell, became the emotional center of the investigation. It was not just a document, it was a voice rising from a century of silence, refusing to be erased. Researchers made copies and began distributing them to genealogical societies, historical groups, and universities across the region. The story of Eliza Drummond and Thomas Harlan spread. Within weeks, new information began to emerge. A woman in Bluefield, West Virginia, contacted the Historical Society with a family story her great-uncle had told her decades earlier. He had been a worker at the Drummond Coal Company in the 1890s. He claimed that in the summer of 1891, a surveyor had been found dead in the Bluestone River, and that the company had paid the local sheriff to rule it an accident. The worker had been told to keep quiet. He never spoke of it publicly, but he told his family before he died. Another lead came from a descendant of the Parrish family, a man named Kenneth Parrish, who lived in Columbus, Ohio. Kenneth's grandfather had left behind a handwritten memoir, never published, in which he briefly mentioned a couple who had stayed at the farmhouse in 1891. He wrote, "They were good people, She was afraid. He was brave. My father hid them for as long as he could, but the coalmen came looking. We never saw them again. These testimonies, though second-hand and separated by generations, began to form a coherent narrative. Thomas and Eliza had married in secret. They had fled to the parish farmhouse. Samuel Drummond, using his wealth and influence, had tracked them down. Thomas had been taken, likely by men employed by the Drummond Coal Company, and killed. Eliza had been forcibly returned to her family and committed to an asylum to silence her. But the question remained, what had happened to Eliza after 1893 when she was released from Weston State Hospital? The archives at Weston contained no further records of her. The Drummond family records, now scattered among distant relatives, offered no clarity. Eliza simply disappeared from history a second time. Then, in the spring of 2001, a cemetery researcher named Laura Finch made a discovery while cataloging grave sites in a small overgrown cemetery outside the town of Welch, West Virginia. The cemetery was unmarked on most maps, used primarily by poor families, and forgotten over time. Laura was documenting the stones for a preservation project when she found a grave with a simple wooden marker, weathered almost beyond recognition. The name carved into the wood was barely legible, but Laura could make out the letters, E. Harlan. There was no date, no epitaph, just the name. Laura contacted the Historical Society immediately. Researchers traveled to the cemetery and carefully excavated the area around the marker. Beneath the surface, they found a second marker, this one made of stone, buried intentionally, as if someone had tried to hide it. The stone read, Eliza Harlan, born 1869, died 1894, beloved wife, forgiven by God. The date of death, 1894, was only 1 year after her release from the asylum. She had been 25 years old. The grave was located far from the Drummond family plot, far from any church, in a cemetery used by the indigent and the unnamed. It was a burial meant to be forgotten. But someone had placed that stone. Someone had carved her married name. Someone had written, beloved wife. Researchers began searching for records of Eliza's death. They found a death certificate filed in McDowell County, dated March 1894. Cause of death, consumption. Informant, Samuel Drummond. Consumption, tuberculosis, was a common diagnosis in that era, often used as a catch-all explanation for prolonged illness. But given Eliza's history, given her confinement, given the isolation she had endured, researchers could not help but wonder if her death had been hastened by despair. The question of who had buried her and who had placed the stone remained unanswered until a local historian found a reference in the records of a small Methodist church in Welch. The church had kept meticulous records of charitable acts performed by its congregation. In April 1894, there was an entry. Funeral service conducted for Eliza Harlan, late of this county. Burial arranged by Mrs. Ada Parrish. Collection taken for stone. Ada Parrish. The mother of the family who had hidden Eliza and Thomas. The woman who had turned away the men searching for them. The woman who had kept their secret. Ada had not forgotten. And when Eliza died, alone and cast out by her own family, Ada had made sure she was buried with dignity. She had made sure the name Harlan was carved into stone. She had made sure Eliza was remembered as a wife, not as a disgrace. It was an act of love, an act of defiance, and an act of memory. The discovery of Eliza's grave brought the story to the attention of journalists and documentary filmmakers. Articles were published in regional newspapers, and eventually the story reached national outlets. The photograph of Eliza and Thomas, once hidden beneath the floorboards of a collapsing farmhouse, was now displayed in museums and historical exhibits across West Virginia. But the story was not complete. Researchers wanted to know more about Thomas Harlan, where he had come from, who his family had been, and whether he had left any trace beyond the brief employment record and the death certificate. David Klein, the graduate student who had found Thomas's death certificate, dedicated his dissertation to uncovering Thomas's origins. He traveled to Tennessee, following the notation in the Drummond Coal Company ledger that identified Thomas as Tennessee origin. In the archives of the Tennessee State Library, David found a birth record for a Thomas Harlan, born in 1867 in Knoxville, Tennessee. His mother was listed as Mary Harlan, a free woman of color. His father was listed as unknown. Mary Harlan had been a seamstress, one of a small number of black women in Knoxville who had managed to build independent livelihoods in the years after the Civil War. She had owned her own home, a rare accomplishment for a black woman in that era, and had sent her son to a private school run by a Quaker congregation. Thomas had been educated, trained in mathematics and surveying, and had worked for several railroad companies before being hired by the Drummond Coal Company in 1890. He had been, by all accounts, a man of intelligence and skill, and he had been targeted not for his failures but for his success. David also found letters written by Mary Harlan to a cousin in Knoxville, dated between 1891 and 1895. In one letter, written in August 1891, Mary wrote, "I have not heard from Thomas in over a month. I fear something has happened. He wrote to me in June, saying he had met a woman and that they intended to marry. He said she was good and kind, and that he loved her. I have heard nothing since. I pray he is safe." Mary Harlan never learned what had happened to her son. She died in 1897, still waiting for word. David's research also uncovered something unexpected: a photograph of Mary Harlan, taken in Knoxville in the 1880s. She was seated in a chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm and dignified, and around her neck she wore a locket. David contacted the descendants of Mary's family who still lived in Knoxville. One of them, a woman named Grace Harlan, had inherited a box of Mary's belongings, including the locket from the photograph. Grace agreed to open the locket on camera for a documentary crew that had been following the investigation. Inside, there were two small photographs, one of Mary herself and one of a young man with a serious expression and steady eyes. The young man was Thomas Harlan. On the back of his photograph, in Mary's handwriting, were the words, "My son, my pride." Gone but not forgotten. The documentary aired in 2003 and was watched by hundreds of thousands of people. It told the full story: Eliza and Thomas's forbidden love, their secret marriage, Thomas's murder, Eliza's confinement and death, and the acts of courage by people like Ada Parrish and Mary Harlan who had refused to let them be erased. The response was overwhelming. Viewers from across the country wrote letters, sharing their own family stories of love and loss, of erasure and resistance. The photograph of Eliza and Thomas, once hidden and nearly lost, became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of the refusal to be silenced. In 2005, the McDowell County Historical Society, in partnership with the Tennessee State Museum, organized a memorial service at the cemetery where Eliza was buried. Descendants of the Parrish family, the Harlan family, and members of the local community gathered to honor Eliza and Thomas. A new gravestone was placed beside Eliza's, a stone for Thomas Harlan, though his body had never been recovered. The stone read, "Thomas Harlan, born 1867, died 1891, beloved husband, his name endures." At the service, a minister read aloud the final entry from Eliza's journal. "I would rather live one true day than a lifetime of falsehood." And then, in a moment that no one had planned, Grace Harlan stepped forward and placed Mary Harlan's locket on Eliza's grave. She said quietly, "So they can be together." The story of Eliza Drummond and Thomas Harlan did not end with the memorial service. It continued to ripple outward, touching lives and altering the way people understood the history of Appalachia, race, and resistance. In 2007, a historian named Dr. Ellen Graves published a comprehensive book about the case, titled Buried Names, Love and Defiance in the Appalachian Mountains. The book became a bestseller and was used in university courses on American history, gender studies, and social justice. Dr. Graves argued that the story of Eliza and Thomas was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a broader pattern of erasure, an intentional silencing of stories that challenged the racial and social hierarchies of the time. The book also included previously unpublished research, including interviews with elderly residents of McDowell County who remembered hearing rumors about the Drummond family. Several of them recalled being told as children never to speak the name Eliza in the presence of the Drummonds. One woman, now in her 90s, said her grandmother had told her, "That girl loved the wrong man, and they made her pay for it." The publication of the book led to renewed interest in other hidden histories across Appalachia. Researchers began searching for similar cases: interracial marriages that had been concealed, people who had been committed to asylums for defying social norms, families who had been erased from public memory. What they found was staggering. Dozens of cases emerged, each one a fragment of a larger, suppressed history. In 2010, the state of West Virginia formally apologized for the treatment of patients at Weston State Hospital, acknowledging that many had been committed not because they were mentally ill, but because they were inconvenient. Eliza Drummond's name was read aloud during the ceremony. Meanwhile, the Parrish family, who had hidden Eliza and Thomas and had honored Eliza in death, became the subject of their own historical recognition. The farmhouse where the photograph had been found was restored and turned into a museum dedicated to ordinary people who performed extraordinary acts of conscience. Angela Parrish, the great-granddaughter who had shared her family's story, became the museum's director. In 2015, a descendant of Samuel Drummond, a man named Richard Drummond, who lived in North Carolina, came forward publicly to acknowledge his ancestors' role in the tragedy. In a letter published in the Charleston Gazette, he wrote, "I cannot undo what my great-great-grandfather did. I cannot bring back the lives he destroyed. But I can say this: what he did was wrong." Eliza and Thomas deserved to live, to love, and to be remembered. I am ashamed of the cruelty in my family's past, and I am grateful to those who refuse to let their story die. Richard donated a significant sum of money to the McDowell County Historical Society to fund scholarships for students researching hidden histories. He also requested that a plaque be placed at the site of the former Drummond estate, acknowledging the harm his family had caused. The plaque was installed in 2016. It reads, "In memory of Eliza Drummond Harlan and Thomas Harlan, whose love was criminalized, whose lives were stolen, and whose names were nearly erased. May we remember them, and may we do better." In 2018, a young filmmaker named Maya Thompson, inspired by the story, created a short film based on Eliza's journal entries. The film, titled One True Day, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and won the award for Best Short Documentary. It featured dramatic readings of Eliza's words, intercut with images of the mountains, the cemetery, and the photograph. The film's final line was Eliza's, "I will carry his name until I die." And then, in a quiet coda, the screen showed the gravestone. Eliza Harlan, beloved wife. The impact of the story extended beyond history and film. In 2020, a group of activists in West Virginia launched a campaign called Say Their Names, dedicated to recovering and memorializing the stories of people who had been erased from history due to racism, homophobia, or other forms of bigotry. The campaign explicitly cited Eliza and Thomas as its inspiration. By 2023, over 300 names had been recovered and memorialized across the state. Each one represented a life that had been hidden, a love that had been forbidden, a person who had been silenced, and each one was now remembered. The photograph that had been found in a metal box beneath the floorboards of a collapsing farmhouse, hidden, nearly destroyed, almost forgotten, had become one of the most powerful images in American history. It was displayed in the Smithsonian, in the National Civil Rights Museum, and in textbooks across the country. And on the back, the words remained: Eliza and Thomas Harlan, married June 14th, 1891. God forgive us both. But now, when people read those words, they understood them differently. It was not a plea for forgiveness for loving. It was a plea for forgiveness for the world that had made their love a crime. History does not forget. It waits. And when the truth is finally unearthed, it does not whisper. It resounds. Eliza and Thomas Harlan were erased by power, by prejudice, by the brutal machinery of a society that could not tolerate their existence. But they were remembered by love, by Ada Parrish, who buried Eliza with dignity, by Mary Harlan, who kept her son's photograph in a locket over her heart, and by every person who, upon hearing their story, refused to let them be forgotten again. Their names endure, and in a world that tried to silence them, that is the greatest defiance of all. If you've watched this far, it's because you believed their story mattered. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really honors the voices history tried to bury. And if this story moved you, if you believe love should never be a crime, hit the like button and share this video. Some names must never be forgotten. Some loves must never be erased. And some truths must be told, no matter how long they've been buried.